I know there are a ton of people out there that claim that birds are like really stupid. They're eating like Cheetos off of the ground and flying into windows and things of that nature, but they do drop deuces on your head and on your car all the time and they get away with it. So maybe they're not as stupid. There's also a theory on the internet floating around that birds are not even real. They're like projections. And then I guess like birds are long lost relatives of like dinosaurs. So birds are interesting, I guess. I don't know. It's an interesting dilemma. But anyways, we're not here to talk about birds. This isn't like a bird watching channel or anything like that. We're talking about McFarlane and some of the newer collectibles that he's been releasing. I'm not sure if this is like the correct terminology, but a lot of these sublines that he's been releasing recently, I mean, his main lines, at least in my mind, have to be like the DC Multiverse, his Spawn line, and then some of the video games and movie 7-inch action figure waves that he's been releasing. I think that's his main forte. I'm assuming that's where most of his fan base knows him from, at least some of the newer collectors that are jumping on board. And I'm assuming that's where most or the bulk of his profit is coming from. And so it's just really interesting that over the past year, I think he's tried to kind of expand his reach in terms of collectibles and what he can manufacture. We just recently saw him work on, for example, the digital action figures that he's been, peddling around. So in today's video, I'm going to take a look at some of these, give you guys my personal take on whether these are good examples of McFarlane trying to kind of reach out to a new fan base, or if this to me is just a lazy, cheap attempt at making a ton of profit or a ton of money off of his consumer base. And I will say, over the past few years, I felt like he's losing touch with the like legitimate hardcore fan base that has made him or has helped him get to the position where he's at. And I feel like he's kind of turning his back on a lot of these collectors. So let's start off with the first one. And I kind of touched on this particular line way back in the day. So I'm not, or I should say more recently within like the last few videos. And essentially he decided to release these like 4.5-inch vinyl little like mini statues or little mini figures. There's no articulation, so I guess they're kind of like statues. The new Todd Mods action figures or little collectibles. What was interesting about this line, and look, when I first saw them, I hailed them as creative. They were like outside the box, something really innovative and creative, something that we hadn't seen before, not only from him but just in general. I don't think this is something that we really see from a lot of manufacturers, and I thought it was pretty cool. I just didn't like the timing of this. The idea is to have like these DC characters in like 4.5-inch, in a 4.5-inch scale. They're really beefed up. They're just like these big, giant, massive figures, but at that 4.5-inch scale, which is really cool. Like I said, the designs were creative. It wasn't based on like any source material. This was just Todd McFarlane doing Todd McFarlane things on DC characters. And I thought it was really cool, but I just didn't like the timing at the time, or even within like the last few months. We haven't really received that many DC Multiverse or Collector's Edition line action figures. Yes, we'll receive some here and there, but it feels like he's getting really lazy towards the end of 2024 and at the beginning of 2025. I'm not even going to talk about the Task Force wave because I feel like that particular wave was just made for a very specific group of collectors, and then a lot of the figures that we've been receiving are just essentially re-releases. I've seen a lot of like that Atom wave being re-released to Walmart and Target. I've been seeing a lot of like the Noel Batman, which is, let's not forget, a re-release of an older figure. Essentially what they did here, I think they gave him a slightly different color palette. They might have given him a new head sculpt if I remember correctly, but the big draw is the fact that it has a wired cape. And they also released an Action Comic Books 1000 Superman that essentially is the exact same body mold if I remember correctly, maybe a new head sculpt, I'm not sure. But essentially, again, the biggest draw is just a wired cape. So he's re-releasing older figures with older tech, older body molds, and then adding capes to them. So do you really count that as a new release? I guess some people will. Just in my personal perspective, they're not new figures. There's no real new tech being involved. There are no new body molds. And so it was kind of weird that he's looking to expand with some of these collectibles instead of at least giving his main consumer base collectibles to pick up, instead of him trying to expand and try to get other people to purchase his collectibles. And as I said, on the surface, this is pretty cool because it allows people that probably can't afford statues that are hundreds or potentially thousands of dollars, and they can have these small little 4.5 inch statues in their display, and it adds a little bit of variety. Like I said, it's something new that isn't really necessarily based on any source material, and I think it's cool on that front. I just thought it was a really weird time frame, at least in my personal opinion. So even though I like the collectible, I don't like when it's being released per se. Now, the other little subline that he's been working on has to be the new Marvel statues that he's been releasing. These are either at the 1/12 scale, or I should say at the 1/10 scale, sorry, and then there are like a few, like every wave will have one or two that are at the 1/6 scale. Those usually go for about $50, and then the 1/10 scale go for about $30. I really like these. Same thing. I thought it was really cool. I think it's kind of like an audition for him to maybe potentially get more Marvel collectors or more Marvel collectibles out in the future. I think if Marvel Studios or Disney really pays attention to McFarlane and realizes like, hey, he's making really good product and it's selling, it's flying off of the shelves, and maybe we could potentially start giving him more Marvel collectibles in the future. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I know some people don't like McFarlane, they don't like his designs, but at least it's like a new take on certain characters and collectibles. And so I would like to see a little bit more of this. We've had, X-Men characters. We've already have like 2 to 3 different Spider-Man statues at different scales. We've had a Captain America. The shading is done incredibly well. I love the sculpt here, and I will say most of these are based on really iconic comic book covers, and I think that just adds like an extra bit of nostalgia to it. So compared to the Todd mods, where I think those particular figures, when they got announced, and now that I think now they're hitting people's hands, they might still be up for pre-order in certain websites, but there are a lot of people already receiving these. It's just a really weird time frame, whereas in the Marvel statues don't really, at least from what I can tell, they're not really cutting into like the DC Multiverse or the Collector's Edition line. They're kind of like, he's been able to kind of separate the two and not use any resources from his main DC line. And we're, at least in that time frame so far, he's done a really good job. And as I said, it just gives him kind of an opportunity to get his foot in the door for Marvel collectibles in the foreseeable future. So I actually like these. They're very affordable. They come with an incredible amount of detail. They're based on some great source material, and overall I think he's done a phenomenal job with this particular subline. Now let's talk about another kind of little subline that he's been rolling out, and I think has been an absolute mess, an absolute disaster. I think when these first got announced, most people thought it was a really cool idea, but I think as time has gone by, as this line has progressed and more people have been exposed to it, it's been an absolute disaster. I mean, a lot of these ended up on like Ross or clearance stores or clearance aisles within Target and Walmart. We're talking about the 4-inch Page Punchers line. Now, the normal 7-inch Page Punchers line I'm okay with, because you're still getting an actual figure, like a 7-inch articulated figure. But with the Page Punchers line, you're essentially just trying to pick up a tiny little semi-articulated figure and a comic book, which in some cases, if you're like a legitimate comic book collector, you probably already have that particular comic book in your display or in your collection. I doubt that many people are interested in the figure itself. So this kind of divided his fan base a little bit, because those people that knew him from the comic book universe kind of felt like this was an unnecessary collectible. And then those people that wanted figures, there are very few people that are picking up like classic retro style action figures nowadays, especially those that come with like 4 to 5 articulation points. I don't think that many people were interested in. And I consistently saw this particular line at Ross or at clearance stores for like $5. I saw them as low as like $3.50. So again, he tried to kind of expand his fan base. He tried to get other people that probably don't collect DC Multiverse, probably don't collect the Collector's Edition line or any of the video game stuff, or Spawn, which is obviously his baby. He tried to reach out to those particular consumers, and I think he just utterly failed. And I think this has been a really constant theme with him, where he's trying to reach out to a new consumer base. He's trying to expand the people that are interested in his products, but at the same time, he just doesn't seem to have that balance. And this goes even further, and this isn't necessarily like a subline, but I've often talked about, for example, the Frostbite editions for the DC Multiverse line from McFarlane, where he essentially takes a figure, puts it in like blue translucent plastic, and then tries to sell it off as like an exclusive to a particular store. And I know there are a bunch of, content creators out there and collectors that claim that because it's a store exclusive, it doesn't take up shelf space, as if that was ever an issue. I just feel like a lot of these, and I don't consider it necessarily a subline because it is still technically within the DC Multiverse line, but that's a perfect example of him getting really cheap. There's nothing creative about it. It's just translucent blue plastic, but he's trying to get as much profit as he possibly can at the expense of his hardcore consumer base. And that's just a prime example of it. We have seen other OEMs do this, specifically Hasbro. For example, I think we had like an AI, like Iron Man that used translucent plastic. We had the Miles Morales Gamerverse action figure, which Marvel Legends action figure, which also had all blue translucent plastic, but there was something behind it. He was supposed to be using his invisibility power, and that kind of made sense. And then you had, the Holocom action figures that were essentially supposed to be like holographic characters that were using this technology to like communicate with each other. That makes sense within the Star Wars universe. That is something that actually genuinely exists. And it just doesn't make sense, at least in my personal opinion. A Frostbite character or an action figure, you're essentially just taking the exact same figure, using the translucent blue plastic, and then forcing it on your consumer base. And again, they're not forcing it. That's probably the wrong words to use or the wrong phrase, but they are essentially throwing it out there. And sometimes as a hardcore consumer, as a hardcore McFarlane fan, you may feel like your back is against the wall just because maybe there might be a long stretch where there are no new collectibles, and McFarlane is essentially re-releasing these type of figures. We had the all gold plastic action figures that he released, and then so on and so forth. He had the patina versions, which I thought was like a huge insult to the consumer base, just because I felt like he was trying to maximize his profits on a lot of these figures. So I feel like he needs to kind of strike that balance in the foreseeable future. Now, I'll cover one last little subline that he's working on, and they're essentially these like Batman cowl collectibles, where they're essentially like small little Batman cowls that you can display in your collection. Now, most people might say, well, what's interesting about that? It's not an action figure. It's not DC Multiverse. They're not articulated. Why would you be interested in this? But I genuinely like this because if you look back at some of the cowls that have ever been released for collectibles, they're like massively expensive. And I know these are a completely different scale. They're not as intricate. They're not as detailed. But for example, the Black Series has their helmet. Sometimes they have like some electric component to it. Other times they don't, and they have a ton of detail, like damage to them, things of that nature. But it's just an interesting quick take from McFarlane. Like, he's trying to make this collectible as affordable as possible while still kind of appealing to his main consumer base. I'm not saying that everybody that collects the DC Multiverse will be interested in something like this, but these type of collectibles, same thing as with like the Marvel statues, for example, a lot of these collectibles from other manufacturers are just massively expensive. Like, if you go and find, or you try to find a cowl, for example, like a hard plastic cowl from somebody else, it could potentially run you, 50 to 100, depending on the scale. Obviously, like if it's a 1-for-1, you're probably looking at a few hundred to potentially a few $1,000s. But if you're looking at like a 1/10 scale cowl, those usually can be marked up by quite a bit. McFarlane is actually keeping these readily affordable, and he's giving you different iterations or different versions of like the Batman cowl throughout the year. So if you want like a very specific one, great, you can pick that particular cowl up. Or if you're just looking to kind of spice up your display, this would be absolutely perfect. There are a number of different OMs that are working on like replica props. For example, I think NECA is doing something similar where they have like little movie prop accessories, like a Batarang, for example, or things of that nature. And usually their prices are way marked up compared to McFarlane. So like I said, it's just a cheaper alternative for people that can actually own like 1-for-1 Batman cowls that are probably hundreds or thousands of dollars. He's actually giving you very, very affordable options here. I've already mentioned the Marvel statues, but that's another perfect example of him actually going out of his way to manufacture things that are affordable. It's not just about him giving collectibles to the consumer, but he realizes who his fan base is, and most of them are looking to spend, about $20 to $30 on collectibles from him. And like I said, when it's something creative, when it's something unique that we haven't seen in the collectible space, great. And sometimes he's giving us stuff that we've already seen, like a lot of these iconic comic book cover statues we've seen from other manufacturers, but they're just massively overpriced. And so I think what he's doing is kind of shrinking them down. Maybe the quality isn't quite there, but he's trying to do it within like that budget that I think most of his consumers are comfortable with. And I think that's something that definitely speaks to the type of person or individual that McFarlane is. So all in all, like essentially what this video is about, I just feel kind of slighted as a DC Multiverse collector or a Spawn collector that he isn't really trying to give us too much recently. It feels like he's scaling back a lot on the 7-inch line or the 1/10 scale line, and he's really focusing in on trying to expand his consumer base rather than keeping his original fan base happy. And I think a lot of us feel that way. First, focus in on the DC Multiverse stuff, continue giving us classic figures, continue giving us new figures that have removable face plates, and they have wired capes and things of that nature. Do all of that, and then on the side, once we're completely fed, once we've got things to buy from the DC Multiverse and Collector's Edition line, then you can do stuff like Batman cowls and things of that nature. I just feel like he needs to realize where the bulk of his consumers are, and where he needs to be at as a manufacturer. But again, this is just my personal take. This is my personal opinion. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Do you guys feel like he's kind of losing his way a little bit here? Do you guys feel like he needs to refocus a little bit more on the 7-inch line, or are you okay with this? Do you not really care? Do you want to see more Todd mods? Am I completely wrong here? Do you guys want to see more Batman cowls and things of that nature? Very curious to see what you guys have to say. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, if you guys enjoy this type of just nonsense rambling about action figures, stay tuned because we do this pretty consistently, about 4 to 5 times during the week. So thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there and enjoy the hobby. Thank you.